right, good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are very, very excited to be here with all of you tonight in person and online to celebrate For a Spell, Sissie Collectivism and Radical Witchery in the Southeast. We are here tonight with the author, Jason Ezell. We are here with Yarrow Koning, who is a Charis bookseller, but also a filmmaker and many other amazing things. And we are also here with Morna Gerrard, who is the archivist for women's gender and sexuality collections at Georgia State University. Morna is the person in Atlanta who, comes to all the things and is like, you should tell your story, and you should tell your story, and you should tell your story. And we're so grateful for her. And so because she was sort of the holder of this archive, or one of the archives that Jason did a lot of research in, we asked her to come and help contextualize it. And in thinking about who would be a great conversation partner for Jason, I thought of Yarrow, because Yarrow has done so much work in interesting alternative queer collective spaces and communities across the South. So Yarrow uses they, them pronouns, and they are a queer, trans, and non-binary environmental educator with a particular interest in queer ecologies and queer climate justice. They hold a Master of Environmental Education degree from Florida Atlantic University and have taught at multiple sites across Florida and Georgia. They are also a multimedia storyteller with a deep passion for documenting stories of queer Southern joy, survival, and resistance. Alongside their work as a bookseller at Charis Books and More, Yarrow is a co-director and impact campaign coordinator for the feature-length documentary Can't Stop Change: Queer Climate Stories from the Florida Front Lines. In their free time, Yarrow enjoys hiking, birding, nerding out about queer animals, reading, and snuggling with their cat. And Yarrow is going to start a queer ecologies book club for us in 2026. So if there are any queer ecologists out there, check it out. We would love for you to join us. And the person of the hour is Jason Ezell. Jason is an LGBTQ plus movement historian and academic librarian, now the head of research and learning services at the Olin and Uris libraries at Cornell University. Recent research interests include the role of affect in movement dynamics, learning, and information activism. They have also taught university seminars on the history of U.S. gay liberation and mentored students' LGBTQ plus related capstone and theses projects. So welcome, Jason. We're so glad that you're here. We're so glad that all of you are here. There will be an opportunity for folks both online and in person to ask questions. So if you're watching online, you can ask them in the chat. You can also ask them in the little Q&A function, which is on the right-hand side of the screen with a little question icon. And for everybody who's physically here with us tonight, we just ask that when the time comes, you raise your hand and let me bring you a microphone. But without further ado, please put your hands together for Jason Ezell.
Was that me? I put my hands together too. I think if you don't mind, I'd like to because as you mentioned, ER, the archives are what really got me caught in some ways with this research and really inspired me. So I would love for Morna to talk a little bit about like the collections that really inform this history. If you don't mind.
Yeah, I am very excited to be here. I will talk about archives till the cows come home. Always happy to do it. But I'm really excited to be celebrating your book, Jason, because I was kind of there pretty early on with you. So, as you know, I'm the archivist for women's gender and sexuality collections at Georgia State. And tonight, I'll talk a little bit about a specific part of the gender and sexuality collections. By the way, we collect manuscript materials, we collect textiles, artifacts, oral histories, all sorts of things, photographs, film, and everything you could imagine. Overall, I'd say our collections focus on activism, grassroots. With the grassroots focus, we have lots of materials about protests and a lot about HIV and AIDS, but that's not what we're talking about today. Um, we're going to talk about fairies and sissies and packets oh my. I'll say most of the students at Georgia State and most of the researchers that I've met don't know a lot about this particular part of gay culture. And I really enjoy telling them about it because it's so unique and so beautiful. And I think I'm very thrilled that you've written something that can actually really tell the whole story. But with me, with all of this, it all started with the very dear Franklin Abbott, who in 2011 was my very first ever donor to the collections. Not only did he do, in September of 2011, he did his first oral history with Wesley Chenault, and then he donated a box of audio cassettes from the Men in Masculinity Conference that I think was in Atlanta. And then from there, we've got many, many months and years of Franklin's collections coming in. And this is actually the finding aid for his papers here. It's not small. It's one of our largest personal papers collections that we have in special collections in the gender and sexuality collections. So long before the papers were processed, Jason made an appointment to come in on a weekend, and I don't like working on weekends, but we had a really good time. I really had a fantastic time. I'd heard a bunch about the fairies from Franklin, but we really got down to the nitty gritty of it. Were you there Saturday and Sunday?
Yeah.
I think we did 2 days, and it was a fantastic weekend. I was very drawn in by what you were doing, and I was just thrilled with the potential future of where this might go. But I didn't realize just how big the project actually was going to be. And then at the end of 2015, in a very dreich kind of miserable day, Jason and I went down to Franklin's house and you interviewed him. And this interview focused much more on the fairy life and the history of the fairies. I learned a great deal that day as well. I'm always learning. One of the things that by the way, I got your book earlier this week. I haven't finished it. One of the things I didn't realize at the time, because I've always just been working with you in the fairies, I had no idea the complexity of the long arch of history. And I'm really glad that you go into a lot of detail in your book. So because of Franklin, this is actually really quite a wonderful thing. The way that the collections evolve and develop often is like serendipity. And the fact that Franklin donated his papers, and he's such an advocate for the collections, meant that other fairy collections came along too. And so we're the official repository for Gay Spirit Visions. We have a lot of members of the Gay Spirit Visions who donated their papers. Dimit Hayes donated his Lysis, we call it the Southern Sissies collection. We've done a lot of oral histories. We did a massive oral history project with Gay Spirit Visions. And I will tell you, to a person, everyone who volunteered to transcribe those interviews fell in love with those men. They are the most beautiful, lovely, just awesome people. And they all wanted to be best friends with you. So I'm just telling you that. Yeah, you're great. So today what I brought with me, I'm not going to talk long, but I want to show you that there's some things outside, including a list. There's some other finding aids if people are interested to see what we have, but there's a list of collections and oral histories and some publications. If you're interested in using them, please feel free to take one of these and then contact me and we can arrange for you to come in and use the collections. I also have some duplicates. We don't throw these away. We always give them away if we have duplicates. And I have some duplicates of RFD, which is prominently featured in the book. So if anyone wants to have one, you're welcome to have one. I also have this. I cannot give you. This is the original of the RFD that you had and I'll just open it up. If you haven't read the book yet, if you haven't seen it, this is early on in the book. We see the first ever ad for the
It's the Sissie
Yeah, the
Collective
Sissie Collective,
in
yeah,
Arkansas.
is in here. So if you want to have a look at it, you can, but you have to do it in front of me. You can't take it away, and you can't eat, drink, smoke, or chew gum when you're doing it. So I am super grateful that all these years ago to today, that's like 10 years, that you finally, this book is here, and it's a stunner. I'm just thrilled that it exists, and that people can actually really understand the importance of this history. It's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Morna. Before we start in the conversation, Yarrow and I wanted to kind of put the book it's making, and also the period that it talks about in some context before we start. And I'll start off a little silly because you reminded me of that time. It was in December 2015 when I came in, and maybe I didn't realize until this moment that I had taken a whole weekend of yours. I was too excited. And then how wonderful it was to go and interview Franklin on that weekend. I will say that I got into historical research, into doing archival research later in life. And it kind of fits. I have some very old friends who call me Gladys Kravitz. If anybody gets that reference, that is the neighbor, I think, from Bewitched, who's always got her blinds parted and being a little snoopy and looking at other people. Being in the archives gives me an opportunity to be kind of a max level snoop in a lot of ways. And I will not forget, I think I enthused to you, Morna, when I found this. Franklin, I got to read all of your letters that you had traded like decades before, and it was so wonderful. And there was one of those letters where I found it was a letter between you and Claire Engelbert, who is another one of the interviewees for the book. And it was a fairly short letter, but I looked at the return address, and Claire's return address was the same rural delivery address of my own family farm when I grew up. So I was like, who is this guy? You know, and I think I freaked out. I was shaking, probably not taking as much care with the paper as I should have at that point. And I think I enthused to you about it. But what I realized, that having grown up in the late 70s on this farm in the middle of very rural Tennessee, that just a few dirt roads over, radical queers were building a world in a very parallel way to me. And I think fairy existence has like a real palpable thing for me, because I'm thinking like it was just across the veil, this magical world that was just on the other side of kind of my farm experience in the late 70s was going on, that I had no idea about until much later in life when I got to read these collections that you talked about, Morna. So when I think about this as like kind of a fairy or a magical context, I know that it has been that way for me, because I encountered through the archives, through the collections, a whole nother parallel world that I didn't know existed right alongside my boyhood in that same rural area. And I also think a lot about how that we went and we got to interview Franklin. And I really am so thankful for you, because this book has been an absolute honor for me to write. But saying that I write a book seems a little bit strange to me, because this is really, after I met you, you introduced me to all of the contacts and the networks that you had from those days, including Michael Wilson, who was so generous enough to sit down for an afternoon and talk to me with my brand new spanking tech skills, which were a little awkward. So I have met some people that I really consider to be not only friends, but also the queer elders who kind of, I've inherited their dreams. And so picked up, like, you know, some of the ones that you've passed on to me in the culture. And it's really those stories, those sissy stories, those queer stories that I hope the book does some justice to. So I really appreciate that. I will also say that I'm honored to be here at Charis, because the book, as you mentioned, Yarrow, it's like the bookstore is referenced in the book. Franklin talked about how important like the women's culture in the city around Little Five Points was at the time. I think maybe Kathy Hope is here online. Kathy also talked about that experience back in the day from the experience of the women's culture, but with that anchor being Charis, which I think I've always understood, even from a distance, has always been heavy on that and more, because it is books, but it is way more than that. It is a community that has really endured. So to be able to come back and share this book launch here is really meaningful for me. So I really thank you, Yarrow and ER and Abeo for like having me here. So that's really been meaningful to me. I want to start really, and then we'll turn it over to the conversation, but I wanted to remind remind me, I think I forget sometimes, there's kind of a dual tone, I think, in the story, this history. I like to focus in the book as much as I possibly can on the joy, on the creativity, on the like connections that are like built in response to what is an incredibly eerily familiar time. It was in the late 70s a time which a lot of people use this term, and you'll see in the book, it was a time of terror. And I want to just take a minute not to overemphasize, it'd be wrong to forget that terror at all, because it is what I think sparked a lot of the creativity and the joy that came out of it. So I really try in the book to emphasize both. But I do want to read just a quick paragraph that kind of gives an idea of some of the main things that created that terror at that time. So 1977 and 1978 were terrifying years. We forget this when we remember Anita Bryant, and Save Our Children through the lens of gay rights alone. We forget the gay San Francisco gardener Robert Hillsborough's murder. We forget the activist suicides in Miami and New Orleans. We forget the emboldened violent homophobia of white Christian supremacists in Oklahoma and Arkansas. We forget how Save Our Children's rabid child protectionism was also racist and sexist and ageist, entangled with anti-desegregation and anti-ERA entrenchments. We forget that these aggressive exclusions overlapped with a time when women of color, like Georgia's Desi Woods, were put on trial for killing their would-be rapists, and when Black children like Gary Tyler of the New Orleans area served prison sentences for white supremacists' segregationist violence. Even if Bryant was increasingly belittled by floods of gay protesters at her poorly attended concerts, Briggs in California borrowed her Save Our Children playbook for a homophobic child protectionist measure, and when his Proposition 6 was defeated, Milk, the gay figurehead of his defeat, was killed with 2 shots to the head. And the whole country watched this on national news. So that gives a sense of kind of the terror that this story kind of is sown through, and also gives a sense of how it had a certain kind of spectral quality, like everyone saw it, so it kind of even had a magnified or amplified impact. And so I wanted to remind us of that context for these stories, and maybe it gives us an idea, possibly. I do want to say, we've already mentioned some of the terms, that how a lot of this culture, a lot of the people did respond to that by reclaiming the epithets that people used against them. So I don't want to fling those words out casually, because they still do hurt for a lot of people who have heard them and felt the sting of those things. But these people decided, a lot of them at this time, to reclaim terms like faggot and sissy and fairy and other words, to try and take pride in them and use them as a point of pride before people used it against them. And I hope that this context helps explain a little bit of why they did that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for reading that passage. That's definitely one that stood out to me as I was reading the book. And I feel like, I learned so much reading this book. This is from an era where I was not yet born, but there's just so many resonances with what we're seeing in the wider culture today. So I really appreciate you presencing that to start the conversation. I want to continue with what you were saying about some of the terms that are used in the book, because one thing that this book really does is it traces the collectivists on their journey, often meandering in their search for what you call a revolutionary queer figure. And at different points in the book, they're using the term faggot as like their revolutionary queer figure. Then they're kind of meandering their way into sissy, and then meandering their way into fairy. And I wonder if you could share for folks here in the audience today, like what you see as some of the distinctions and how they were using those terms. And maybe too, like what the relevance of these terms are to our movements for queer liberation today.
Okay, thank you for that question, Yarrow. It's one I'm a little nervous to answer, because I think when I first started doing this research, I started focusing on Radical Faeries, which was a community that I had some exposure to, and I started asking the question, like, well, what is a radical fairy? And people pretty soon cautioned me against that question and let me know that was an easy way to step in it. So answering the question, like defining this, is a little bit tough because people have told me the answer I got for that question in a standard way was there are as many different definitions for radical fairy as there are radical fairies. And I did find that out very quickly. And then when I ask people, so when you said that you like identified as a faggot and you identified it as a sissy, what did that mean? And people said, like, I don't know. I use the words interchangeably. I would use them in the same sentence and call myself both of those things by turn. Or I encountered a lot of people would say, like, I really don't know what you're I never use those terms myself, so I think it has to be taken as part, I would say, instead of being something that really like defined an identity, it was kind of a practice that became improvised in a way, and people would use these terms fluidly, I think, in a lot of cases. But if I look to what people wrote and how people use those terms and in the context they use them in, I think you can see some distinctions that get made in practice, maybe if not in language always. But when people said at that time that they identified with the word faggot, a lot of that came out of the research that was done by leftists out of early New York's Gay Liberation Front, people who were looking for the history of homophobia, and they did also follow the histories of witchcraft, and they had this sense, this belief that there were queer men who were also sacrificed on those fires with queer and radical women who were called witches at that time. So if someone identified as a faggot in that time, they identified in alliance, I think, with those non-normative women who were like very radical at that time. They identified to a degree or felt themselves in partnership with radical feminists who were their peers in the current day. And they also, like a lot of those like feminist witches, the religious scholar Cynthia Eller says they use a martyrology where they take those fires of the burning times and then they kind of take that and they turn it out. They use that fire. The only reason that they were burned in the first place was because they were so powerful. They were such a threat. So they were in a way already on fire. So faggots would take that fire too and use a similar kind of militant kind of politics as their identity. Sissies, in 1976 at Wolf Creek, some gay liberationists of color critiqued the use of that word faggot because they felt that it drew so much on European experiences of colonialism, etc. And so a lot of those people took exception. A lot of sissies agreed that we don't necessarily need to use that word exclusively, but sissies also disagreed with how militancy was often expressed in masculine ways. And so how could you conceive of a femme militant? In a lot of ways at that time, especially like leftists, were very much expressing their radicalism in masculine forms. So sissies would choose this non-binary expression out of a kind of way to find a leftist expression of those radical perspectives. And they also often kind of refused either a purely female or a purely male kind of gender expression. And they often, in some cases, especially with LaCis, as you mentioned earlier, Morna, who were in New Orleans, they often emphasized child care, educational reform, and activism around information as part of their work. And then finally, the fairies are I started there. The fairies are the babies on the block in a way. So the fairies came with in 1979, I think, at the Radical Faerie gathering that Harry Hay is most known for kind of fomenting that culture. A lot of them, according to LaCis, used their ephemerality. A lot of times they would like disappear into the woods. A lot of them associated themselves with like environmental movements and associated themselves as protectors of nature. According to Larry Mitchell in his book, Faggots and Their Friends, which is at the front counter, a lot of those fairies would build sanctuaries so that the militant like faggots and sissies could have a place to recharge and then shoot back into the fray. So I don't think those are absolute definitions, and I'm sure that they're not the ones that people have used those terms but always identify with, but in practice they establish some themes.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I'm sorry to give you you were nervous about to start.
You should totally do that. No, that's great. Yeah, it's over. No.
And I understand it's like they say there's many definitions of the word queer as there are queer people. So I appreciate your take on that and the way you talked about these both like as somewhat identity terms, but also this like piece around tactics kind of embedded in them too, like ways that they saw themselves responding to or not responding to the state from a leftist perspective. So I want to look a little bit more at the fairies and also at the title of the book, For a Spell. So spell work is a pretty big theme in this book, but it came across in ways that I wasn't necessarily expecting when I started reading it. So you really open the book with a ritual, and at many points, like there is some sort of collective or personal spell work or ritual that's marking the structure of the book, that's like keeping the book moving along. And you also talk a lot about like this concept of sissy magic and radical witchery, and it's always like the magic isn't just for personal empowerment in like a more new age sense. It's like weaved together with the collectivists' like political praxis. So I'd love if you could just talk more about the collectivists and how they used ritual and spell work as part of their broader movement for queer liberation.
This a question that I love this question. I think there's a lot to say about it. I think I want to start with what was kind of striking to me is I think For a Spell, the title of course evokes magic, but it also evokes that Southern kind of like sit for a spell. Like, and so it kind of is a playing with time also. I want to start answering the question by saying that at this time in the 70s, how do you respond to a scenario where people often felt like their movement was dead? The gay liberation fronts were fomented outside of, from the Stonewall riots, and they popped up immediately after. And so many cities, so many places across the country had gay liberation fronts pretty fast immediately after that. Most historians say that by 1973, most gay liberation fronts had disbanded and folded. So a lot of people were like, where is our movement? It's kind of dissipated in a way when you use the gay liberation front as the measure for its presence. So a lot of people were already testing the pulse of gay liberation almost as soon as it happened, right? So they're trying to say like, oh, where is our movement gone? Also, Arthur Evans, who wrote Witchcraft in the Gay Counterculture, he says that life in imperial U.S. context of the late 70s, he describes it, which I think is so interesting, is a one long night of the living dead. And he said that we are all dead to nature, we are dead to each other, and we are dead to ourselves. It's almost like it had sapped our ability to feel or to connect with each other. So in this scenario, which I think when people like activists and movements are exhausted, understandably, in times of terror, what do you do? And I think the answer was that a lot of people turned to something like magic, right? What were the solutions that were in place politically for a lot of people to keep their passion and their drive alive? A lot of it was very dialogue, language-based, and very intellectual. You might turn to therapy. You might turn to consciousness-raising groups. You might turn to lectures, which a lot of these were conferences. They were talking, political lectures. But that always, you don't necessarily sustain your feelings or your energy through intellect. And so I think that a lot of these cultures, the faggots and the fairies, they used ritual and spell work, not taking away from the investment in their meaning or their actual being spells, but they also knew that they could keep their energy raised in really low times, and they could also revive or keep their dreams alive, seeing possibility even beyond that terror. And when you do it as a group ritual, you are raising that connection again. So you don't always have to rely only on yourself to pull yourself up by your emotional bootstraps. Your peers in a ritual can like bond together, and you see that mirrored back in you. Also, if you are bringing down a powerful goddess figure, invoking a goddess figure and bringing her down, you will feel energy brought into yourself, and you will see yourself aspiring to those revolutionary qualities that you hope that you can embody. So I think that a lot of this was about restoring connections and energy for the longer movement, which is I didn't say the full title of Larry Mitchell's book, which is Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions. So it's what do you do when you're between revolutions? So I think magic was the solution in a lot of these cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think a lot about how me and all my friends, we're into astrology nowadays. So I think that's one of the like queer magics that's really popular at the moment. And I know, at least for me, part of the reason I'm interested in astrology is connects me to the broader universe and gives a sense of meaning in a time that can feel really like meaningless and difficult.
What's your sign?
I'm a Gemini.
Oh, so my husband, I'm a Virgo librarian. There's no hope. It's like, it's so completely agree.
I think only a Virgo could have really written this book potentially. So
it's got that stamp on it.
It's the details.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to shift focus a little bit. And I want to talk about this concept of solidarity, because so much of your book is tracing gay liberation movements, but you make it very, very clear in your book that gay liberation is not isolated from the other movements for liberation that are happening simultaneously. And that's just not a position that you took as the author. It's very clear in some of the decisions that the collectivists make throughout the book that they want to be working across race, sex, and class lines while also fighting for gay liberation, albeit in imperfect and sometimes messy ways, I would say. So I'd love if you could share more about how the collectivists understood and practiced this kind of solidarity, whether you could talk like within the context of their home or within the context of their broader political work, whatever feels appropriate to you right now.
Yeah, I think I continue to do work or think about this question. It's such a big question. I would like to think maybe enter the answer to the question by thinking about LaCis, the New Orleans collective. I think it's chapter 5 or 6 I talk about this, but they come to New Orleans, and the activist community that they encounter is mostly represented by a group called the Gertrude Stein Society. And in fact, when I talk to people like Aurora or Dimid who were in LaCis, they remembered that Gertrude Stein Society as like, oh no, they were just a conservative social group. They had tea parties or whatever, right? But it was actually that they were a liberal gay rights group, and they did do a lot. They were focused on stopping police entrapment of gay men in parks, for example. They were focused on making sure that Anita Bryant did not come back to New Orleans. They were focused on developing a really strong gay neighborhood identity and a voter bloc, and they also were focused on having a gay and lesbian newspaper, so a gay and lesbian voice was clear. But when LaCis came to New Orleans, they were still thinking from a gay liberation standpoint. So when they took over organizing the first what Gertrude Stein called a gay pride rally, they said, no, it's a gay liberation rally. They invited ACLU people. They invited Unitarian Universalists. LaCis also said, we believe that our main mission is to be out queer people supporting fellow movements. So they went to ERA marches. They went to African Liberation Day. They went to Philippine Independence Day. They went to labor and worker demonstrations. And one thing that I focus on in the book is they supported like the mostly Black teacher-led teacher strike. They went to support that in their work. And so the Gertrude Stein Society came back and really rejected LaCis politics. They said, what you are doing is diluting gay unity. And LaCis responded that solidarity was, in their mind, solidarity is what made them gay liberationists. That is the work of gay liberation. And so what they said was, where we work for gay unity is in going to these other movements and supporting them as out proud queer folks. But they said we are also trying to build gay unity by looking at the people who are marginalized even within our own community. So they were really focused on like very young queers, older queers, disabled queers, and people of color who really didn't find an easy access to a lot of the events that people were calling gay unity at the time. And so they felt like they really were ultimately helping that gay unity. Very quickly talking about how messy it can be and how difficult that can be. And this is something I can't see very clearly myself, but I read about this in other historians' work, that the work of solidarity, revolutionary solidarity at the time, coming out of the 60s into the 70s, people did not feel completely able to collaborate with each other because their experiences were so distinct. So, for example, Huey Newton of the Black Panthers recommended that white anti-racists get involved at a certain point with the white Panthers because it wasn't time to work together. People needed to look internally and build their own analyses and practices. A lot of what was called lesbian separatism at the time was separatist, but it was not imagined as a permanent end goal. It was a process where people who had different experiences under capitalism could pull apart and reflect on what their experiences and their challenges were, so that when they joined the conversation could be very precise about what they asked for and needed with people who had different experiences, if that makes sense. But what the challenge was, when people were caucusing or working in different movements, no one knew when it was time to come together yet. So this separation kept people constantly thinking, is it time to come together? How do we come together? And that created fissures where it was very, very hard. The conversation, the lack of intimacy across those lines at that point didn't always recognize the intersectional experiences of people who were involved in both movements. And that was very hard. And the people that I studied, they talk about at the time, I don't know if we've done enough work to be ready to partner in this way yet. Is it time or not? And so that created very difficult kinds of separations that people did not want. So I don't want to idealize. LaCisse was very clear that they were not always successful in creating the solidarities that they wanted.
Right. Yeah. And you talk in the book about how LaCisse in part was founded because of the breaking apart of Mulberry House along class lines specifically.
Yeah, and in that case too, the working class sissies who stayed in Arkansas basically had told the middle class sissies who then went to New Orleans that they wanted them to work on their class difference, but they also wanted them to analyze race because they weren't as prepared for racial analysis. And so a lot of the LaCisse both wanted to better understand working class perspective and racialize, especially Black Southern experience, better for their own purposes and solidarity. They needed to grow in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for answering that question, and for leaning in your answer and also in the book into some of the messiness that happens when we try and work in solidarity with each other, because that is still incredibly relevant and will continue to be something that we all need to be focusing on.
One last side, when you say that, I think something that really moves me is I think that in these moments, because everything is so urgent, like you can feel the terror, you can feel the urgency of the people's experience. There can be a rush to be decisive, to know what to do immediately, and to have the right ethical point of view and have that decisive action. One thing that I really was moved by, because I feel that urgency. Of course, we all feel that urgency. But one of the things I believe that LaCisse came to and reflected on is maybe it's okay to be messy when we don't have the right answer. Let's just own up to the fact that we don't know. Let's not think about solidarity as a static state, because who would want that kind of solidarity anyway? But think about it as a process. And this is where I'm at in the process, which makes me look kind of unfinished or unresolved. And that's okay, because we are changing together. And I think that kind of resistance to a position of righteousness and being in process in terms of solidarity is something that we can feel and move with. And so I felt like that was a real for me, a really important takeaway from that working through solidarity processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to continue on the broader theme of like lessons that we can learn from actions that the Sissie collectivists took during this time period. And again, I really appreciate how you started this evening with just a reminder of the climate of terror that was occurring in the 70s and is like re-emerging in these like new contemporary forms today. So as I was reading, I really noticed the similarities where queer and especially transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people are once again being targeted. So this is another big question. I'm just giving you big question after big question because I've got big questions. But what are some lessons we can learn from these sissy collectivists and their tactics for survival, resistance, and collective defense that they were leaning into?
I will say briefly what some of the things that I've really focused on, and then we have so many of the people. I think several people who are out online, and it's also, as Michael and Franklin are here, maybe if you guys don't mind to reflect on some of those things that you see as resonances between that time and this, and maybe what some differences are. And so I'll talk for a little brief point, and if you have some things that you would like to add, I would really appreciate that, having the lived experience of both of these times. One of the things that this is a personal takeaway. I often have to frame everything with the fact I'm a Virgo and a librarian. So this is kind of where I see things, but was really drawn to how LaCis and a lot of the lesbian collectives that they were inspired by really at a time when your institutions fail you, which is every time. I mean, so I say, like, who did those institutions succeed, or who were they successful with? But I think people of privilege, like I have felt like, like the institution's really doing me right at certain times because of certain privilege I have. And then it should not be shocking, but it is when they do fail us, right? And I think that so much of the culture of that time, especially that was led by lesbian feminists, were really invested in saying, what if we just did this ourselves? Like, what if we just built our own bookstore community? What if we just had our own food production? Like in Arkansas, there was a women's trucking collective. We'll just take it ourselves, right? And so for me, so many of our institutions are failing us right now, as they always have, but in a new and very theatrical ways. What does it look like to lean into our connections, into our peers, into our neighbors, and to really think, what are some of the ways we can't build this tomorrow, but what are some of the ways that we can build a process to do this for ourselves when it is dangerous to rely upon an institution to do that? And I'm really inspired by the range of ways that people did really improvise answers and solutions, projects to work on together. And there's a lot of those examples in the book. So that's something I'm really, and as a librarian, there were lots of publication, education, childcare initiatives that I'm personally very much inspired by. But I wonder if maybe some of the collectivists in the group have some things you would like to add to, like, what seems parallel, if at all. I'm sorry, because I'm just looking at the two of you guys right on the front. I actually leaned in too. See what you can do.
The thing that was so wonderful and amazing for me about our early fairy movement here in the Southeast was that I just really kind of disappeared into it. It became my life. And the first gathering that we had, and it's a fun story for another time, was at a farm that Michael owned called Running Water. And it was just an absolutely magical experience. I think there were 25 or 30 of us who showed up sort of miraculously, and we kept gathering. We did it every 6 months, and then we had to have it in the winter too. And it just became the world that I lived in. And I think that it truly, truly sustained me, through the AIDS years, where things were really horrible. So I think that we created that community because we couldn't find ourselves anywhere else. We in this beautiful natural place that Michael was living and where he invited us, we just, it just sort of happened. And it's like we all knew something that we had no words for until we got there and began to have an experience. I went to the 30th anniversary of the first Yarrow Koning gathering this past summer. I was invited to be the facilitator for the first one. It's on an island off the northern coast of Holland. And we talked about this because there were, 7 or 8 old timers there, and about how there's just a knowing that we have when we come together that is a sense of purpose. Why are we here? A sense of connectedness. And I think we need that in a world where there is so much noise and so much alienation. And each of us brings it back to the world in a different way. We're, whether it's in relationship to other people in other communities, or to nature, or, simply, I don't know, it was transformative, for me. My fairy self was always there, but it emerged, and it just has never gone away. And I don't think about it a whole lot now because that's just who I am. I also wanted to be, a major player in my own movie, in a culture where so much is externalized, that we are, paying attention to things outside of what's going on in our lives and outside of our connections. So it's provided me with that, I don't think I could have had a more interesting life.
I'm just going to add that what Franklin said about it just happening. It just happened. And the movement of collectivism spread worldwide. We didn't do that. It just happened. There were people that came to some of the gatherings in the Southeast early on and then moved to Europe or moved to Australia. And now there are these same collectives of people loving people. I mean, it's not just men loving men anymore. It's expanded. And from my own experience, the same thing has happened with an institution here in town, and that's the gay choruses. Voices of Notice, the parent organization, and there's a women's chorus and a men's chorus. Those two choruses are not just women and men anymore. It's a whole collective of all aspects of humanity all coming together, and our mission is to change hearts and minds through music. But to me, that's just an outgrowth of what happened to us way back.
Thank you both for sharing. I'm going to ask you one last question to close, which is, I would love to know from you, what are some of the revolutionary queer dreams sustaining you right now?
So I think piggybacking on one of the things I think about, there's a scene that comes from, that's played out often in the books on New Orleans, on the streets of New Orleans in the quarter, where these sissies they have this very, this non-binary gender expression. A lot of them have the beards, but they're wearing skirts or flowy, beautiful clothes, but they're also wearing earrings, growing out every other fingernail, and painting them different colors. And they're moving on the streets of the quarter, which at that time was very tourist dollar, selling lots of is when it became what we know of it now, as lots of beads and plastic and tourism kind of catching things. But they said it was very common for children on the street to stop them and say, "Oh, are you a man or a woman?" And they would respond, "Oh, I'm neither, I'm a sissy." And they would say that then. And there was a sense that there was a reflection or a gloss on why they said that, which is to open up possibility, to use wonder, to not say or convey back or mirror back to children that you must be this or that. It's your dream, your wonder that takes you where you want to be. And I feel like that it was framed at a time when queer folks were not welcome as teachers, right? You couldn't be around children, so you couldn't be teachers, but it was kind of framed as their pedagogy, as their classroom. This is where we meet people and we broaden minds and open hearts this way. And for me, having worked in higher education for a very long time and having worked in libraries for a very long time, I am very excited dreaming about what it might be for those institutions to be driven by wonder and possibility rather than foreclosure, gatekeeping, and those kinds of things. Most of the people who work inside of those institutions have those values at their heart, but they're not predicated on that first and foremost. And I think, what might they be? What might those things be if they're in the streets or if they're in community led rather than institutionally led? So I have a long list of like specific possibilities that come out of those dreams. So thank you for asking, and I'll keep writing those down. And
Yeah.
Thank you, Yarrow.
Thank you. I think we should open up for some questions.
Yeah. All right, Julia.
Okay. So I loved it that you started when you talked about the Anita Bryant with situating it with desegregation, because I think people forget that all the time. And I was really interested when you were talking about the trajectory of gay liberation, and people are like, oh, it died in 1973 or whatever, because people say the same thing about feminist movements, right? That there was this break in the 70s, but then all this work by radical women of color came out in the late 70s and early 80s. And so I'm wondering if some of these collectives were spaces where that kind of other knowledge that doesn't get highlighted so much was happening. And this is sort of a related but separate question. I know your book is focusing on the South. Were most of these collectives in the South, or is that just your interest?
So I'll answer that second one first. They weren't all in the South. So I'm kind of startled. I just moved to like Ithaca, New York, and someone said, oh, we did that. There's a house, Lavender Hill, that you want to meet any of those people. So they have another collective that was there. A lot of these houses were networked beyond the South. So a lot of them were networked into the Pacific Northwest, to the Oregon area. And of course, we have like the Oregon Women on the Land who are collaborating with Alpha at this time. So these collectives through print culture and travel are very networked. Like they have events and they have their own publications, which function kind of like there was a faculty member and said, this sounds like pre-internet social media, because it's like bulletin boards, how you meet people through these print vehicles. And then you advertise there's going to be this skill sharing event or whatever. And then people travel like amazing. I was thinking about driving from the Ozarks, for example, to Wolf Creek. And then for people saying like, why did you show up late? I'm like, you just drove that away. So they definitely were not the only ones. I'm interested in I feel like the collectives in the South, they developed a kind of an identity, and they networked together that were really responsive to some kind of where that Save Our Children entanglement of like sexism and racism and homophobia had its home, right? So how do you respond to that very close to where it's originating? I think there was a culture that developed around the collectives here that were very aware of how close they were to those cultures. The first one, I think that you're absolutely right. You talk about women of color. GLFs had a formal organization. So in some ways, they're leaving themselves consciously to history. Sometimes these organizations, and I do think about this now, Yarrow, go back to one of your questions, like some of the things we can learn. I'm starting to think not everything has to be promoted. Some things are meant to be exchanged interpersonally and like let's say comrade to comrade, we'll say in this case. And I think some of the people who did a lot of the great work, as you mentioned, were not leaving them to posterity because they were hoping to have a posterity, right? So they were working very close together. They weren't as concerned about leaving it into the institution yet. But now, like archival work can go back and hopefully gather some of those stories together. So I think your comment is spot on. We remember by those people who are kind of built to be remembered institutionally, if that makes sense.
Hey,
Hey, Sarah.
I'm going to turn your own question back on you a little bit. What parallels do you see between then and now? Which ones do you see, and what do you think are the most sort of applicable lessons or strategies that they were using that people could use to cope with all of this?
That is an incredibly great answer. I cannot answer this question. I mean, I think it's just, I think I only have my perspective, right? And I think I can only see certain windows. And so I'm very acutely aware of, like, I only see this kind of work so much, right? And so, of course, like when Yarrow asked the question, I'm very inspired because I work in like cultural memory institutions. I work in libraries. I work in education. I'm inspired by what knowledge production, what publishing, and what, education could be. But what I am thinking about when I look at that time and how seriously the violence which we see happening now. So the timeline for building a new institution around institution is a quite long one. That's a kind of luxury to imagine that we will have that timeline. It happens to be where my skill set is, but I'm really amazed that people very thoughtfully turned to these small collectives of people across the South, started to map them to each other internally, and started to conceive of them as places where people could circulate who were in danger to avoid the violence that was imminent for them, and started to think about, like, oh, look at this rhetoric, look at the actual violence that is emerging out of this rhetoric. How do we bring people into this network so that they can be moved to safety? And then also people, kind of going to the institution question again, people are trackable when they are in an institution, right? So a lot of the work of this time was people taking assumed names, using only PO boxes, trying to find ways to lower their visibility and remain, with the help of some of these collectives, very mobile to stay 2 or 3 steps ahead. I think I'm in a certain place of luxury where I don't have myself yet to think about those things, and I'm not maybe in a position of having that collective to offer it, but I'm amazed because we can see that this is there are clearly people, especially under the xenophobic gaze right now, who are already, we are seeing this happen. How can we have those people stay ahead of the violence and kind of lower their profile to move ahead? These were some answers that were brought at that time fairly quickly to mobilize these rural sites for those purposes. I think I'll just add to that. I think I just want to be clear that I think part of the book is that a lot of these rural sites are they are retreats, right? And they are places for people to rebuild energy. But one of the things that I think was most remarkable to me is that they were overtly conceived of as an underground also. And so people realize that you network these sites to collaborate to each other, but they are not. That's one of the main points of the book, is it's not just a collection of discrete collectives, but people moved from one to another, and that they were conceived of as an underground at this time of really acute spiking violence.
Do I need to scoot over? Sorry about that, y'all. Okay, so I had a question. I've only read a part of your introduction. I apologize. I'll read more. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for being here tonight. You mentioned in the introduction, and you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, about faggots looking kind of toward to Europe in a way, and the name faggots and kind of aligning themselves with the witches because they saw research that said faggots, gay, homosexuals back in early modern and medieval Europe, I guess, were being burned along with the witches. Like they were the bundles of sticks essentially that were used to light the pyres that were burning the witches. I'm just curious. I've studied early modern witch trials and witch hunts and things like that. I've never seen anything like that. Do you? I mean, were they on? I mean, was that? Have you seen primary evidence to suggest that that was actually happening, or was this something that they kind of took some different sources together and compiled it?
I've never seen any validation of this. I think my own way of thinking about it is at the time, like a lot of what's her? I'm going to mess up her name, but like, was it Margaret Murray? Was that her name? The witchcraft historian who made the argument that there is like this continuous tradition of witchcraft from that time until now. And a lot of people, I mean, Arthur Evans even kind of takes up a little bit of this argument. In some ways, my understanding or my read is that the culture doesn't necessarily need that validation of a continuous lineage to kind of embrace it as a figure that is evoked from the possibility, from the fact that there were heretics that were identified based on sexual and gender nonconformity, that they can use a kind of imagination that there is this influence to today to take it as if it's an influence and mobilize it now for part of their activist energy. I think there was a lot of Arthur Evans, who had left academia, was very much saw education as like an empowered and elitist institution, and we needed to get outside of those things. And so I think that he felt like a lot of these people felt like proving the historical line was less important than taking the power that came from the possibility and enough of a suggestion. That's the way I've taken it. It's mostly I think an etymological argument that's, just the history of the language and the echo between faggot as a bundle and faggot as a slur now creates this opening or this possibility that can't be proven, but as a possibility, we're willing to capitalize on it for what could happen with that now. But I haven't seen any validation of that actually happening. I think it would be very hard to prove.
Right.
But also I have friends who are medievalists who would say, Jason, why are you talking right now? I don't think that I'm a great person to answer the question. I say, oh, I'm a historian. They go, no, you're not. 70s is yesterday.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody got one last question? Okay.
Now, what was the Save Our Children movement?
I'm sorry?
What was the Save Our Children movement?
Oh, so Save Our Children, Anita. Well, so what is pretty interesting is I tend to think about the gay rights movement starting when gay people organized to push back against Anita Bryant in the 1970s, like late 1970s. So before that, in the early 70s, places like Miami-Dade County had already passed anti-discrimination laws so that they would not discriminate against gay people in terms of employment or public services. The Save Our Children campaign, for which Anita Bryant was the spokesperson, was a conservative backlash against that protection of homosexuals. And one of the things that was most alarming, or that they used to alarm other people, to kind of queer bait folks, was imagine that your child is in the care of this queer, this gender nonconforming or hypersexual queer man or queer woman, or at the time, they were the same people who were behind it were also trying to stop desegregationist busing initiatives, and were trying to block the Equal Rights Amendment for women. So what it did was the Save Our Children movement, which Anita Bryant was the voice of, it created this alarm around your children are being recruited by homosexuals, and it created, and she as a celebrity had a certain platform and voice. It did create that alarm. A lot of violence happened after it, and immediately that anti-discrimination law in Miami was overturned. And so the discrimination of homosexuals was then again legalized almost as soon as it had been established. And immediately after that, other cities saw, oh, we can do this kind of popular vote referendum, get everybody hyped up about this or upset or worried. And other discrimination, anti-discrimination laws were flipped immediately after it. So it was this kind of backlash against some very early wins that had been made in terms of like gay legal protections, kind of in the name of protecting kids who are being exposed to these perverted, non-conforming homosexuals.
Well, I want to thank y'all for such a robust and interesting conversation. Morna has brought materials that are out front. So there's a finding aid. There's also more information just about the collection in general. And so I'd love for y'all to browse up front, y'all who are physically here with us. For folks who are online, you can click the teal button at the bottom center of your screen to buy For a Spell from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for supporting your independent feminist bookstore. And for all of y'all who are here, you can get your copies tonight. You can get them signed. You'll just stay right there and people will come to you and I'll bring you a
I'm good
pen.
at staying right there.
Yeah, just sit for a spell, as they say.
I am doing that really well right now.
So yes, thanks for everybody watching online and thanks for everybody being here.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.